In November 1885, Mei Lin arrived in Red Lodge, Montana, with one battered suitcase and nowhere else to go. Snow swept across the wooden sidewalk. Her red padded coat, sewn by her mother in Canton, stood out against the white storm. She had traveled from San Francisco for honest work as a seamstress. Instead, before the night was over, she would be thrown back into the snow. And the cowboy who saw it happen would offer her the one thing no one else would: a safe place to sleep. The stagecoach rolled away before she could catch her breath. Ahead stood the Gables boarding house. A preacher in California had promised that Mrs. Gable welcomed weary travelers, no matter where they came from. Mei Lin clutched his letter and pushed open the door. Inside, a cast-iron stove filled the room with heat. 3 men sat near it, and Mrs. Gable stood behind the counter. The moment they saw Mei Lin, the room went quiet. Mrs. Gable didn't say hello. She didn't offer a seat by the fire. Her eyes moved from Mei Lin's wet coat to her face, and her expression hardened.
"We don't have any rooms," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was as flat and cold as a prairie road in January. Mei Lin stepped forward, her boots squelching on the muddy floorboards. She reached into her coat and pulled out the folded, precious letter. "I have a letter, ma'am," Mei Lin said softly. Her English was careful, precise, and clear. Her father had insisted she learn the language of this new, golden country. "The Reverend Miller said you might have a place for a worker." Mrs. Gable didn't even reach for the paper. She folded her thin arms across her chest like a barrier. "I don't care if the president himself wrote that note. I don't take in your kind." One of the men at the table let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a bark. "Better go back to the railroad camps, girlie," he called out. "Or maybe back across the wide ocean where you belong." Mei Lin felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. It wasn't the warmth of the roaring stove. It was the burning sting of shame. She had done nothing wrong. She had traveled for weeks through dust and ice to find honest work as a seamstress. In 1885, Chinese families in the West lived under constant suspicion and hostility. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been law for 3 years. Only weeks earlier, violence in Rock Springs, Wyoming, had left Chinese families terrified across the frontier. Mei Lin had heard enough stories to know that a lone woman could not expect mercy from every town. "Please," Mei Lin said, her voice trembling just a fraction, "the storm is very bad outside. I have silver to pay for my stay." Mrs. Gable stepped out from behind the counter. She grabbed Mei Lin's suitcase and shoved it violently toward the door. "I said no. You bring your trouble and your heathendom somewhere else. I have decent, God-fearing families staying here. They don't want to wake up and see a China woman in the hallway." The door was flung open by a gust of wind. The gale howled into the room, bringing a swirl of jagged ice. Mei Lin was pushed back into the biting cold. The suitcase hit the frozen snow with a dull, final thud.
The heavy door slammed shut. The iron bolt clicked into place with the finality of a coffin lid. Mei Lin stood alone on the porch. The wind tore at her hair, pulling it loose from its pins. She looked down at her suitcase, already disappearing under a fresh layer of white. She had nowhere to go. She didn't know a single soul in this frozen town. She walked down the steps, her boots sinking deep into the drifts. The town of Red Lodge was closing its eyes for the long night. Lanterns were being extinguished in the shop windows. The only light came from the rowdy saloon across the street. Laughter and the tinny, broken sound of a piano drifted through the storm. Mei Lin knew she couldn't go there. A lone woman would not be safe among men fueled by whiskey and hate. She found a small sheltered spot under the overhanging roof of the mercantile. She sat on her suitcase and pulled her knees tight to her chest. The cold began to seep into her very marrow. It was a heavy, seductive, sleepy kind of cold. She thought of her father. He had been a great healer in Canton.
He had taught her the secret names of every herb, leaf, and root. He had died in a terrible fire in San Francisco, trying to save his small shop. Now, she was all that was left of his ancient legacy. She closed her eyes for a moment. The falling snow felt like a soft, heavy blanket. She felt her heart rate slowing. "Hey." The voice was deep, low, and resonant. It sounded like the distant rumble of thunder over the mountains. Mei Lin jerked her head up, her eyelashes heavy with frost. A man was standing a few feet away in the swirling light. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the narrow space of the sidewalk. He wore a long, dark duster coat, heavily dusted with fresh snow. A wide-brimmed black hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes. Beside him stood a massive, powerful black horse. The animal's breath came out in thick, rhythmic clouds of steam. Mei Lin scrambled to her feet, her legs nearly giving out. She backed against the frozen wooden wall of the store. She was absolutely terrified. Was he one of the men from the boarding house?
Was he coming to finish what Mrs. Gable started? The man didn't move toward her. He reached out a gloved hand and adjusted the cinch on his saddle. "It's a bad night to be sitting on a suitcase, miss," he said. He didn't look at her directly, showing a strange kind of respect. He spoke to the horse, or perhaps he was speaking to the wind itself. Mei Lin didn't answer. She watched his every move with the intensity of a hunted animal. He turned his head slightly. The dim light from a nearby lantern caught the planes of his face. He had a strong, square jaw covered in dark, rough stubble. His eyes were the color of the Montana sky just before a summer storm. He looked profoundly tired. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness. "I saw what happened at Gable's place," he said. For a moment, Silas looked toward the boarding house. His jaw tightened. "My mother would haunt me forever if I rode past and left you out here," he said. He stepped a single pace closer. Mei Lin flinched, her back hitting the timber. He stopped immediately, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Silas Thorne. I've got a ranch about 3 miles up the northern ridge." Mei Lin tightened her grip on the suitcase. A stranger's kindness could be as dangerous as a stranger's cruelty. "I am fine here," she lied, her pride refusing to break. Her teeth chattered so hard she could barely form the words. Silas looked at her thin, damp coat. He looked at her small, red, trembling hands. "No, you aren't. You'll be a block of ice by the time the sun rises." He reached down and picked up her heavy suitcase. It looked like a child's toy in his massive, weathered hand. "I've got a spare room," he said quietly. "It's warm and it's dry. There's a heavy lock on the door. And the key stays with you," Silas said. "You will not owe me anything for tonight." Mei Lin stared at him, searching his face for a trick or a hidden cruelty. She looked for the malice she had seen in the eyes of the townspeople, but she found only a quiet, steady, and weary kindness. It was the kind of kindness that didn't ask for a price. Mei Lin felt something finally crack inside her chest. The iron strength she had used to hold herself together for months began to crumble. A single hot tear escaped her eye. It froze almost instantly on her pale cheek. She fought back the rest with everything she had left. She would not break down in front of a complete stranger. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. Silas tossed her suitcase over the back of his horse and tied it down with ease. "Because my mother raised me to be a man, not a beast. And because no human being should die in the snow just because of where they were born." He held out a large, calloused hand to help her onto the horse. Mei Lin hesitated for only a second. She placed her small, frozen hand in his. His grip was firm, certain, and incredibly warm.
He swung her up behind the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. "Hold on to my belt," he commanded. He climbed up in front of her, his body shielding her from the wind. The horse turned away from the flickering lights of the town. They rode out into the absolute, crushing darkness of the mountain trail. The wind screamed around them like a choir of ghosts. Mei Lin pressed her face against the rough wool of Silas's heavy coat. It smelled of old leather, strong tobacco, and comforting wood smoke. To her, it was the smell of life. It was the smell of safety. They rode for what felt like an eternity. The trail climbed higher and higher into the jagged mountains. The pine trees were silent, white-shrouded ghosts in the dark. Finally, a small golden light appeared through the thick timber. It was a low, sturdy cabin built of massive, hand-hewn logs. A barn stood nearby, the horses inside whinnying a warm welcome. Silas led the horse right up to the porch. He helped Mei Lin down. Her legs were so numb she nearly collapsed into the snow. He caught her by the elbows and steadied her. "Inside, quickly," he said. He pushed open the heavy timber door.
The heat hit them like a physical embrace. The cabin was simple, clean, and sparse. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, glowing with embers. A thick rug made of gray wolf pelts lay on the floor. In the corner, a small girl was sitting at a rough wooden table. She looked to be about 6 years old, small and fragile. She had Silas's dark hair and those same hauntingly pale eyes. She was clutching a rag doll with missing button eyes. One sleeve of the doll had torn away from its little shoulder. Mei Lin noticed it at once, but said nothing. When the door opened, the girl didn't jump or cheer. She didn't run to her father with the joy of a child. She just watched them with a hollow, silent, and haunting gaze. "This is my daughter, Sarah," Silas said, his voice softening. He took off his hat and shook the heavy snow from the brim. "Sarah, this is... I'm sorry, I didn't ask your name." "Mei Lin," she said softly, her voice returning. Silas nodded slowly. "This is Mei Lin."
"She's going to stay in the sewing room for a while." Sarah didn't say a single word. She didn't even blink her eyes. She just turned her head slowly and looked back at her doll. Before Mei Lin went into the sewing room, she quietly picked up the doll from the table. By morning, the torn sleeve had been mended with a neat line of red thread. Sarah noticed it before anyone else did. Silas let out a long, heavy sigh that was full of hidden, jagged pain. "She hasn't spoken a word," he whispered to Mei Lin. "Not since her mother died in the fever last winter." Mei Lin felt a sudden, sharp pang of sympathy. She knew the heavy, suffocating silence of grief. She knew how it could swallow a person's soul whole. Silas pointed to a small door off the kitchen area. "That's the room. There's a small stove in there. I'll light it for you." He brought her suitcase in from the cold. He worked quickly, starting a crackling fire in the small iron stove. The room was tiny, but impeccably clean. There was a narrow bed covered with a colorful patchwork quilt. A small window looked out toward the high moonlit peaks. "There's warm stew on the bake stove," Silas said. "Eat what you need. We'll talk about the rest in the morning." He left her then, closing the door as softly as a breath. Mei Lin sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She listened to the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the house, the crackle of the seasoned pine in the fire, the low, steady murmur of Silas talking to his silent daughter, the wind rattling the heavy rafters above. She opened her battered suitcase. She pulled out a small, embroidered silk pouch. Inside were her father's ancient brass scales and a few dried, precious roots. She held them tight to her chest. For the first time in a very long time, she felt she could finally breathe. She fell asleep to the rhythmic sound of the dying storm. But in her dreams, the snow was falling on a peaceful garden in Canton. The next morning, the world was blindingly, beautifully bright. The sun reflected off the fresh snow with a brilliance that physically hurt the eyes. Mei Lin woke early, driven by a lifetime of discipline. She dressed in her red coat and stepped quietly into the kitchen. Silas was already outside, his silhouette visible through the frosted window. He was chopping wood in the yard. the axe rhythmic and steady. Sarah was sitting at the table, exactly as she had been the night before. She was staring blankly at a bowl of cold gray oatmeal. Mei Lin didn't say a word. She moved quietly, with the grace of a shadow, around the kitchen. She found flour, dried apples, and a jar of golden honey. She began to bake. She made small, sweet dumplings, the way her grandmother used to in the spring. The aroma soon filled the small cabin. It was a sweet, spicy scent that cut through the smell of old pine. Sarah tilted her small head. She watched Mei Lin's hands with growing curiosity. Mei Lin moved with a precision and grace the girl had never seen. She set a plate of warm, steaming dumplings in front of the child. Sarah looked at the plate. She looked up at Mei Lin's kind face. Slowly, she reached out and took one with trembling fingers. She took a small, hesitant bite. A tiny, beautiful spark of life appeared in her pale eyes. She didn't speak, but she ate every single dumpling on the plate. When Silas came in, he stopped dead in the doorway. He looked at the empty plate. He looked at Mei Lin, who was busy scrubbing the wooden table. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice thick. "I wanted to," Mei Lin replied simply. Silas sat down, his heavy boots thudding on the floor. "I need to tell you something important, Mei Lin. The folks in town, they're narrow-minded and full of fear. They'll find out eventually that you're out here. It might bring a storm of trouble to my door." Mei Lin looked him straight in the eyes. "I can leave. I do not wish to bring harm to your home." Silas shook his head firmly. "I'm not asking you to leave, Mei Lin. I'm just telling you to be careful."
"I've got a reputation for being a loner, a man who keeps to himself. Most people stay away from Thornridge. But people talk. They always talk when they don't understand something." Mei Lin felt a heavy lump of emotion in her throat. She realized that Silas was risking his own safety and standing, all for a woman he had found freezing on a sidewalk. "Why did you really help me, Silas?" He looked out the window at the rugged, eternal peaks of the Rockies. "My wife was a school teacher who came all the way from Boston. She came out here to change the world with books and kindness. The town didn't like her much either. They thought she was too educated, too independent for a woman. When she got sick with the fever, nobody from town came to help. I watched her life slip away in this very room, all alone. I promised myself that night I'd never let someone suffer alone again, not while I have breath in my lungs." He stood up and pulled on his worn hat. "I'm going into town for supplies and to hear the talk."
"Stay inside. Keep the door barred until I return." The days turned into weeks as the winter deepened. Mei Lin became a vital part of the rhythm of the ranch. She mended Silas's heavy work clothes with invisible, perfect stitches. She cooked meals that were a beautiful bridge between West and East. She taught Sarah how to fold paper birds from old, discarded newspapers. Some evenings, Silas stood quietly in the doorway and watched them. He never said much, but Mei Lin began to notice that he smiled more often when Sarah laughed with her eyes. One night, Mei Lin mended a tear in Silas's work shirt. Their hands brushed when he reached for it. Neither of them spoke, but neither of them pulled away too quickly. The girl still didn't speak a word, but she followed Mei Lin everywhere like a silent shadow. She held on to the hem of Mei Lin's red coat like it was a lifeline to the world. Then, one morning, Sarah did something that made Silas stop in the doorway. She placed Mei Lin's mended doll on the table and pointed toward the front gate. A rider was coming up the ridge.
Later that afternoon, as Mei Lin was hanging wash in the thin winter air, the rider finally reached the cabin. It was a man in a heavy tan coat with a silver star pinned to his chest. The sheriff. Mei Lin felt her heart gallop against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to run, to hide in the cellar, but she stood her ground. The sheriff pulled his horse to a slow stop. He was a middle-aged man with a weary, lined face. "You the one everyone's whispering about in town?" he asked. He wasn't aggressive, but his eyes were sharp as a hawk's. "I am Mei Lin," she said, her head held high. "Thorn is taking a risk by letting you stay out here," the sheriff said. "Men in town are saying you have no right to be here. They are wrong, But angry men do not always care about what is right. Mei Lin looked him directly in the eye, refusing to flinch. "I am not hiding, Sheriff. I am working and earning my bread." The sheriff spat on the frozen ground. "There's a group of men in town who call themselves the Order of the White Cross. They don't like Silas, and they sure as hell don't like you."
They are looking for an excuse to frighten you and pressure Silas. Tell him to keep his eyes open. The sheriff turned his horse and rode away into the gray mist. That night, Mei Lin told Silas about the sheriff's visit. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He just sat by the fire, sharpening his hunting knife with a whetstone. "Let them come if they must," he said grimly. "This is my land, bought with sweat and blood. I'll defend whoever I choose to have under my roof." But the trouble didn't come with torches and guns as they expected. A week later, another massive storm rolled in from the north. This one was far worse than the first, a true Montana whiteout. The wind battered the cabin walls and erased the trail beyond the porch. In the middle of the blackest night, there was a frantic, desperate pounding on the door. Silas grabbed his Winchester rifle, his face set in stone. "Who is it?" he shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's Mr. Gable. My wife runs the boarding house in town. For God's sake, open up."
Silas threw back the bolt and opened the door. The same man who had laughed at Mei Lin inside the boarding house stumbled through the door, covered in snow and ice. He was white as a ghost, his eyes wide with a pure, primal terror. He was carrying a heavy bundle wrapped in blankets in his arms. "It's my boy, my only son," he sobbed, collapsing to his knees. "He's got the croup. He can't get any air into his lungs. The doctor is stuck in a drift all the way in Billings. Someone in town said the woman here knows the old medicine." Silas looked at Mei Lin. She had already stood up, her instincts taking over. She saw the small boy, no older than Sarah, in the man's shaking arms. His face was pale, and every breath came with a harsh, frightened struggle. Mei Lin didn't hesitate for a single second. She forgot the insults and the way he had spat at her. She forgot the coldness and the hatred of the town. She only saw an innocent child struggling to breathe. And suddenly, she was no longer in Montana. She was back in her father's little shop in San Francisco, listening as he taught her that fear must never come before mercy.
"Put him on the table immediately," she commanded. Her voice was suddenly strong, resonant, and filled with an ancient authority. Gable obeyed like a child, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Mei Lin ran to her room and grabbed her silk pouch. She needed heat and she needed steam. "Silas, boil every drop of water we have, now." She pulled a small pouch of dried herbs from her suitcase, the last remedies her father had taught her to prepare. She began to crush them in a stone bowl with frantic energy. The boy's breathing was getting shallower, more desperate. Every gasp sounded like a struggle against a heavy, closing iron door. "He's dying," Gable cried out, dropping to the floor in despair. "My boy is dying, and it's my fault." Mei Lin ignored him completely. She took a clean cloth and soaked it in the boiling herbal water. She placed it carefully over the boy's face and chest, creating a tent of steam. The room began to fill with a pungent, sharp, medicinal scent. "Breathe," she whispered in her native Cantonese, a prayer of old. "Little one, breathe for your mother who is waiting." Sarah came out of her room, drawn by the commotion.
She stood by the table, her eyes wide, watching the dying boy. Minutes passed like hours in the flickering lamplight. The only sound was the whistling wind and the boy's ragged, terrifying gasps. Suddenly, the boy let out a long, wet, rattling cough. He sucked in a deep, shivering breath of the medicinal steam. Then another, and another. Little by little, some color returned to his lips as the warm steam eased his breathing. He opened his eyes, looked at his father, and began to cry. To Mei Lin, the sound of that child crying felt like a miracle. Gable bent over his son, then looked up at Mei Lin with tears on his face. "I was wrong about you, Miss May," he said. "I was wrong, and you saved my boy." Mei Lin only nodded. The child needed his father more than she needed an apology. Gable collapsed against the log wall, weeping with a profound relief. But then, something even more miraculous happened in that cabin. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. She reached out and gently touched the boy's small, pale hand. "He's okay now," she said.
Mei Lin covered her mouth with one hand. Tears filled her eyes, but she turned away for a moment so Sarah would not feel afraid of them. Silas looked from his daughter to Mei Lin. For the first time in a year, hope returned to his face. Then Silas looked at Mei Lin. There was gratitude in his eyes, but something deeper was there too. A quiet understanding that she had changed the life of his daughter and his own. The voice was small, hesitant, and rusty from a year of disuse, but it was clear as a mountain spring. Silas froze where he stood. The rifle slipped from his hand and hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. He dropped to his knees and pulled Sarah into a fierce embrace. "Sarah," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Oh, my sweet Sarah." Sarah held tightly to her father, then reached one small hand toward Mei Lin. Mei Lin crossed the room and took it. No one in the cabin needed to explain what that moment meant. The cabin was filled with the sound of weeping and the scent of healing herbs. For one quiet moment, no one in the cabin thought about fear, anger, or the past. They were simply a father, a child, and the woman who had chosen mercy when she had every reason to turn away. The next day, the storm finally broke, leaving a world of pure, silent white. Gable took his son home, wrapped in Silas's warmest blankets, but he bowed his head low to Mei Lin before he rode away. News of the miracle on Thorn Ridge spread like wildfire through Red Lodge. The Order of the White Cross never came to the ranch. A few men still rode past Thorn Ridge after dark, watching from a distance, but none of them dared step onto Silas's land. Too many people in town now knew what Mei Lin had done for Gable's son. Fear had not vanished from Red Lodge, but it no longer had the whole town on its side. The town didn't suddenly become a perfect paradise of equality. There were still whispers in the shadows. There were still cold looks from those who refused to change. But Mrs. Gable sent a basket of fresh eggs and a side of bacon to the ranch. It was as close to a holy apology as she would ever be capable of giving. Life on the ranch transformed with the passing of the seasons. The spare room was no longer a temporary shelter for a traveler. Mei Lin put up lace curtains she had embroidered herself. She planted a small, thriving garden of healing herbs near the porch. She and Silas spent long, quiet evenings by the roaring fire. They didn't speak of the pain of the past anymore. They spoke of the possibilities of the future. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of gold behind the peaks, Silas took Mei Lin's hand. "You don't have to keep that suitcase packed anymore, Mei Lin," he said. Mei Lin looked at her battered suitcase, which sat in the corner of her room. She realized she hadn't even thought of touching it in many months. "I think I might stay," she said, a smile touching her lips. "Not because I have nowhere else to go," Mei Lin said, "because I have somewhere I want to be. Sarah needs me to teach her how to fly more paper birds." Silas smiled, a real, deep smile that finally reached his tired eyes. "You brought light back into this house," Silas said. "Back into Sarah. Back into me." He looked toward the window where Sarah was folding another paper bird. "I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but I know I do not want to face it without you." They stood together on the porch, looking out over the vast, wild land. The Montana sky was a deep, endless, and hopeful blue. The mountains were no longer walls of ice, but walls of protection. Mei Lin felt the warmth of the setting sun on her face. She was no longer the shamed woman from the cold street. She was a healer of bodies and a restorer of souls. She was a friend, a mother, and a partner. She was, at long last, home. From inside the cabin, Sarah laughed softly. It was only a small sound, but Silas and Mei Lin turned toward it as if it were the beginning of spring. The frontier was a place of legendary cruelty and hardship, but it was also a place where a single act of courage could change the course of a life.
Silas Thorne had opened his door to a stranger when the world told him to close it, and in doing so, he had saved himself and his broken daughter. Mei Lin had brought her father's ancient wisdom to a land that feared her, and in doing so, she had found the family she thought was lost forever. The snow would always fall in the high country of Montana. The wind would always bite at the heels of the weary. But inside the sturdy cabin on Thorn Ridge, there was a fire that would never go out. It was the fire of a family built not of blood or law, but of choice and sacrifice. And that is the most powerful, most beautiful kind of family there is in this world.